Why Italians were not considered white in America. Today, in the United States, Italian Americans are seen as part of white America. Italian surnames are everywhere. In politics, in Hollywood, in sports, in music, in business. Italian food is considered American comfort food. Italian culture is celebrated. Italian heritage is worn with pride. But there was a time when being Italian in America did not mean privilege. It meant suspicion. It meant poverty. It meant danger. It meant being called dirty, criminal, inferior, unfit to become American. And for millions of Italian immigrants, especially those from Southern Italy and Sicily, the question was not simply, were they white? The real question was much darker. Were they white enough? This is the forgotten story of why Italians were not fully considered white in America. At the end of the 19th century, millions of Italians crossed the Atlantic. They were escaping hunger, unemployment, political instability, and the brutal poverty of rural Italy. Many came from the south, from Sicily, from Calabria, from Campania, from Basilicata, from villages where the land could no longer feed the people. They arrived in America with almost nothing: a suitcase, a family name, a dialect, a Catholic faith, and the hope that America would give them something Italy could not: a future. But the America they found was not the America they had imagined. At Ellis Island, they were inspected, questioned, judged, numbered. Their bodies were examined. Their eyes were checked. Their names were misunderstood. Their clothes were mocked. Their accents made them sound foreign. Their poverty made them look suspicious. And their skin, often darker than Northern Europeans, made them seem dangerous to many Americans. In the racial imagination of the time, America did not see all Europeans the same way. Northern Europeans were considered more desirable. Anglo-Saxons, Germans, Scandinavians, people imagined as disciplined, Protestant, civilized, and easy to assimilate. But Southern and Eastern Europeans were often seen differently. Italians, Jews, Slavs, Greeks. They were described as emotional, unstable, backward, too Catholic, too tribal, too dark, too close to Africa, too close to poverty, too close to crime. For Italian immigrants, this was not just prejudice. It became a label, a stain, a warning sign. Newspapers described them as dangerous. Politicians questioned whether they could ever become real Americans. Scientists and social theorists placed them lower in the racial hierarchy. Employers used them for the hardest labor, then accused them of taking jobs away from real Americans. Italian men dug tunnels, built railroads, worked in mines, laid bricks, cleaned streets, carried stones. They helped build the America that looked down on them. And still, Many Americans did not see them as equal. They saw them as something in between. Not black, not fully white, not foreign enough to exclude completely, but not American enough to accept. This was the strange and painful position of Italians in America. They were legally close to whiteness, but socially pushed to the edge of it. They were allowed into America, but not always into American respectability. They could work, but they could be insulted. They could serve the country, but they could be treated as a threat. They could be counted as white on paper, but in the streets, in the factories, in the newspapers, and in the minds of many Americans, they were something else. One of the darkest examples happened in New Orleans. In 1890, the chief of police, David Hennessy, was shot and killed. Before he died, rumors spread that he had blamed Italians. The city exploded with suspicion. Sicilian immigrants were rounded up. More than 100 people were arrested. 19 men were eventually put on trial. The press called them criminals before the courtroom could decide. The word mafia was used like a weapon, not to describe evidence, but to mark an entire people as dangerous. Then the trial came. Some of the accused men were acquitted. Others had no final conviction. But for the mob, that did not matter. On March 14th, 1891, thousands of people gathered outside the parish prison in New Orleans. They broke into the jail. They dragged Italian prisoners from their cells, and they killed 11 of them. 11 Italians. Some had already been declared not guilty. Others had not received a final verdict. They were not killed in secret. They were killed in public, in broad daylight, in an American city. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and it was aimed at Italians. The message was clear. To the mob, these men were not neighbors, not citizens, not human beings deserving the protection of the law. They were Italians, and that was enough. The shock reached Italy. The Italian government was furious. Diplomatic relations between Italy and the United States collapsed for a time. There were even fears of a serious international crisis. But in America, many people defended the mob. Some newspapers did not treat the murdered Italians as victims. They treated them as a problem that had been solved. That is how deep the hatred went. And New Orleans was not the only case. In the 1890s alone, more than 20 Italians were lynched in the United States. Think about that. Italian immigrants were not only mocked, they were not only underpaid, they were not only stereotyped, they were killed. And sometimes, country barely cared. This is why the question of whiteness matters. Because whiteness in America was never only about skin color. It was about power, acceptance, safety, belonging. It was about who could be seen as respectable, who could marry into the mainstream, who could move into certain neighborhoods, Who could get better jobs? Who could be trusted by police? Who could be protected by the law? And who could be blamed before evidence even appeared? For many Italians, whiteness was not automatic. It was something they had to fight for, something they had to prove, something they had to perform. And often, that meant hiding parts of themselves. Some Italian families changed their names, not always at Ellis Island, as the myth says, but later, at school, at work, on stage, in business. A name like Giuseppe became Joseph. Antonio became Tony. Salvatore became Sam. Concetta became Connie. Italian surnames were shortened, softened, Americanized. Not always because people were ashamed. Sometimes because they were tired. Tired of being mocked. Tired of being rejected. Tired of being foreign every time they introduced themselves. Language disappeared too. Parents told their children, "Speak English. Do not speak dialect outside. Do not sound like us. Do not give them a reason to laugh." A generation of children grew up understanding their grandparents, but answering in English. Italian identity survived, but often it survived quietly. Inside kitchens, inside churches, inside Sunday dinners, inside family stories. Outside the home, many Italians learned to become less visible, less loud, less foreign, less Italian. Because becoming American often meant becoming acceptable, and becoming acceptable often meant becoming whiter. That is the uncomfortable truth. Crescente, speranza, missed at cost. Italian Americans did not simply become accepted because America suddenly became kind. They became accepted through work, war, politics, money, popular culture, and distance from the poverty of the first immigrant generation. Their children went to school. Their sons fought in American wars. Their families moved out of the old neighborhoods. Their food became popular. Their entertainers became beloved. Their politicians gained power. Their surnames became familiar. The same country that once feared Italian immigrants eventually fell in love with Italian culture. Pizza became American. Pasta became comfort food. Frank Sinatra became the voice of a nation. Joe DiMaggio became an American hero. Italian Americans entered movies, music, sports, unions, police departments, city halls, and the middle class. And slowly, the meaning of being Italian changed. What had once been a mark of suspicion became a source of pride. But that transformation came at a price, because many Italian Americans had to leave something behind. A language, a dialect, a village memory, a way of dressing, a way of speaking, a visible foreignness, a part of the old world. They entered whiteness, but they did not enter it untouched. And that is why this history still matters. Because when people say Italians were always white in America, they are only telling part of the story. Yes, Italians were often legally classified as white, but socially, they were treated as racially suspect, as inferior Europeans, as people who had to prove they belonged. as immigrants who were close enough to whiteness to be absorbed, but foreign enough to be hated. This is the story hidden behind the Italian-American dream. Before the pride, before the parades, before the restaurants, before the celebrities, before the idea that Italian culture was lovable, there was fear, there was shame, there was violence, there were signs, there were slurs, there were lynchings. There were families who changed their names so their children could survive in a country that did not fully want them. So the next time someone says Italians were always accepted in America, remember New Orleans. Remember the miners. Remember the workers. Remember the children who stopped speaking their grandparents' language. Remember the families who became American by hiding the parts of themselves America hated. And remember this: Italians did not simply become white in America. They had to own the right to be seen that way. And before America loved Italians, America had to learn to stop fearing them. This is Uncensored Italy.